So our next speaker, not yet a PhD dropout, was actually voted by all of his PhD classmates as the person they would most want to be stuck with on a stranded desert island. Yes, please welcome Dusty.
This isn't my focus on what I'm studying, but it is a kind of a side project I did when I first got there working in the consulting lab. I should note the fun fact, whatever Jared said about how my PhD cohort, they voted me as the one that they would most like to be stranded on a desert island with. I was super happy that they voted me that. You know, I'm thinking like, oh, what a nice popularity contest. If you're stuck one-on-one with somebody like on a desert island for, I don't know, years, like they'd want to be with me, how nice. But I found out it's mostly because, you know, I have this Army background and they think that I would help them survive the longest. So not quite the compliment that I thought it was. And speaking of that, I have the results in a pie chart, nonetheless. So I'm going to win several tufties today, and this fly is going to join me, several tufties, because I have a number of pie charts, some graphs not well explained, so we'll critique it all at once. And I feel like I can't look this way, I have to look that way. I'll probably be looking this way the most. Maybe I'll change the side of the mic while I talk. There we go. Maybe. How about that? Okay. I was also flattered that they thought I would be the first person to die among the cohort. But it's mostly because I'm about twice the age of most of the people that I'm with. They're closer in age to my children than they are to me. So it's certainly an eye opener when that happens. I'm also got one vote for most likely to be arrested, so I don't really know what to make of that. I'm the red one here. You know, I could get a Dundee for confusing me for not a Dundee, a Tufty. For Office fans, I'm glad the generation hasn't passed enough that we don't know what the Office is. But maybe the most concerning is that I had quite a few votes for most likely to get a non-statistics job. And it probably doesn't bode too well with the rest of my talk that we have going on, that they don't have that much confidence in me. So with that being said, I'm going to talk about a little bit of military leadership and world leadership. So we all know that these four people up here are presidents, but what else do they have in common? Good guess. They all have military service. We know Grant from his fame during the Civil War. Kennedy was in the Navy. President Nixon was also in the Navy, and Bush the first spent some time in the Army Air Corps. The question we're going to try to answer through some analysis is, does the military service of world leaders influence them when they're in charge and they have the choice of whether to involve their nation in a militarized dispute? Now, I'm bringing up a very touchy subject. I recognize that I wear a uniform. I'm in the Army. What I'm talking about today has nothing to do with me being in the Army. This does not reflect Army policy, nothing. So I don't want to end up on the New York Times or Bloomberg or anything like that because of the results I present here. So what you should be thinking is, how did you get involved in doing this research? So I should explain for a second before I jump into it all that yes, I am at a PhD program at Baylor. I started my time in the Army as an engineer officer. About the 10-year point, I transitioned into doing operations research. It has led me to degrees at Ohio State and also to teaching at West Point. I'm scheduled to go back to West Point after the PhD program. That is the reason I'm at Baylor right now doing this. So there you have it. Oh, I also I didn't use Leaflet. I'm sorry, Jared. I use ggmap. But the reason I use ggmap is because one of my advisors on my dissertation, I don't know if you know Dr. Kale, he's the author of ggmap. He's quite a talented statistician and R-coder. Google him sometime. He's a really impressive man. Speaking of impressive people, Dr. Sturdivant's my other advisor. While I've known him from being in the military and having served with him in different locations, he is a local Waco celebrity as he's participating on Dancing with the Waco Stars. So he rivals Chip Gaines maybe for Waco fame. But Dr. Campbell approached the statistical consulting department at Baylor, and he's a political scientist, and he's asking us this question to help inform some of his research is what we just talked about. Are leaders with military experience, like what impact does that have on whether or not their countries are in militarized dispute? I'm going to go through this process, give conclusions, and then I'm going to hedge a little bit. So just have that in the back of your mind as I go through all this. What he brought with him when he was asking us to do this research was the LEAD data set. As you can see, LEAD stands for Leader, Experience, and Attribute Descriptions. Essentially, dating back to the 1800s, it has information about every world leader, from information about their family, their work life, their political background, the type of country that they're in, and the nature of their military service if they had any. And there's also an indicator variable that is our variable of interest of whether or not their country was involved in a armed conflict, or military dispute is the official term, while they were in office. They could have taken over that office at the time of the dispute, like they could have already been in the dispute, and that would count for them. So this isn't necessarily causal. So that, like I'm saying, should be in the back of everyone's mind. All right. So as I'm talking to you about this, I'm assuming several things. One of those is that you have a little statistics background. I'm going to talk to you as if you understand things like log odds ratios, p-values, things like that. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you as if you have a little R background. I assume everyone does, or is at least very passionate about that, or we wouldn't be here. And then lastly, you might not have showed up here interested, but maybe you're interested in the the real world question, whether these people's service impacted any of their their decisions when they were presidents of the United States. And I should just note now, I'm showing only US presidents, but this is at large throughout world leaders of the entire globe. All right. So back to the main point. Let's actually start talking at the data. So Tufte Award number 1. What I'm showing here, I guess number 5, and this is the 5th chart I've got up, is a stacked bar chart using Baylor colors, go sick 'em bears, of each factor relating to their military background. So were they in combat or not, yes or no, and the percentage of those individuals who were involved in a military dispute versus those who didn't. So you can see if you didn't, because the green bar gets larger, you are more likely to have been in a military dispute when you were the leader of the country. According to this, we're going to look at the interactions behind all this in a little bit. And the same is true if you served in a career and also military non-combat. And some of you who have done some model building exercises before, you're probably already jumping up and down saying, oh, these things relate so much, there's interactions. You're right. And I'm spilling water on myself, so I'm just going to set this down here so I don't do that again. I got excited. So we want to take a look at that as a part of this, and we will do that. But before we do, let's look at some of the factors that might influence this. One of those might be the years in office or the years in politics. It does appear, and I've also taken the log because to the trained eye, you can tell this is already skewed data, and even the log is skewed. But those who, let's look at years in office. The median years in office, when the longer a person is in office, the more likely it appears that they get their country happens to be in a military dispute. We can see the opposite of that is true with years in politics. And also when it comes to age, the older you are, it appears on average, the more likely you are to get your country in a military dispute. I hope your company's not in a military dispute, but some might say that's the case around here. I don't know. Okay, back to these Baylor bar charts. Here's some more factors. You can see a couple things. One, if you have a creative side to you, like this is part of arts before you got into politics, before you became a world leader, you were more likely to be involved in a military dispute. Less likely if you were considered an illegitimate child. Medicine, you can see is about 50-50, and I'll let you just kind of ingest the rest of that while I go on to the next. And now I'm only showing you 6, 7, 8, 9 factors. There was about 70 or 80 factors that we considered in this. And speaking of how to consider all of these, if you've been in a statistics 101 class, you've probably done some model building exercises like forward selection or backward selection. There's inherent problems with all of these because what happens when you do multiple hypothesis tests, you get into all sorts of false positives and all the things. That's kind of the downside of some of these factors. Dr. Sturdivant, who I mentioned before, wrote a book called Applied Logistic Regression, where he introduces purposeful selection that tries its best to get around that. And what purposeful selection does is it is a 7-step process where you look univariately at every factor in the model, and you do a ton of steps, some of them iteratively, and you eventually get a final model, and you've looked at interactions, and you've tried to get all the intricacies. I'm not going to go through every step here, but I'm going to focus maybe on 3 of them here as we go through the rest of this process. And the first thing I did, because it wasn't really built out in any package, was I built my own function to look univariately at every factor versus whether or not the leader was in a military dispute during their time. And I did this in the following way. I built a, oops, I didn't want to go that way. There you go. I built a function that takes factor, and then it builds a formula, CW init was the indicator variable, that would create this formula and then do our standard logistic regression that most of us are probably familiar with. And then it did a lot of cleaning of the data, and then it would output a little table here with, if the factor was age, you could see the age has a slightly positive influence with a very small p-value. So univariately, we would conclude that age is an impact. Maybe the older you are, the less you care about the rest of your life. I don't know what to make of that. But when we look at this for all the factors of interest, I just mapped over this. It took about 2 minutes, which is frustratingly slow for 70 factors. We end up with this data. And you can see univariately, a lot of factors are significant. So what we ultimately do is we'll take all these into our first preliminary effects model, where we want to start testing interactions and iteratively removing insignificant factors. We draw a line eventually. It looks like I drew the line right about here at 0.01 or 0.1 p-value, and we didn't consider the rest of those for the rest of this analysis. I'm not going to go through each step because it was quite tedious. But earlier I alluded that there might be some sort of relationship. Like, what if somebody was was in combat and a career in the military? Those two might have some sort of multiplicative effect. Or what if somebody was in combat but not a military career? When you build a model in R, you can create all these indicator variables, but I wanted to be a little more specific about it. So I created my own variable that combined these 3, handling all of these factors together. And as terrible and as mind-numbing as it is, I labeled them 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0. It's awful, but that's why I have this little chart here to help us understand what I did. And you'll notice that these are mutually exclusive. You can't have been in combat and been in the military but not went to combat. Does that make sense? So that's why those don't overlap. When we slowly get down to the final model, we'll get to the punchline where we can see the impacts of the variable of interest. And it does appear as such that each one of these, with the experience of 101, which who knows what that means, I'll pull up a chart in a second, of 101, you do have a slightly positive effect on whether or not your country will be in a military dispute while that person is a leader. Now, I've done my best to help us see these impacts in the next chart. So don't award me up front with the tufty. Oh, that's not it. That's sorry, I'm ahead of myself. This is Jared's favorite COAF plot, or at least a version of it, where we can look at the uncertainty on each of these, and you can see the wide range we have on each one of our factors. But the more interesting one I want to talk about is this. What I've done here is I've faceted it out, the types of experience that all of our presidents have had. In the top left are just the presidents who've got no military experience whatsoever. In the top right, these are the presidents that were both in combat and had an entire career in the military. These are the presidents who were in combat, but did not have a career in the military. And these are the presidents who were in the military, but didn't end up in combat, but also didn't serve an entire career. All right. Now, the second thing to look at is the green or the blue dot for each one of these people is their coefficient or the prediction of whether or not they would have taken their country to war with all their other factors. So we showed some before, like were they a doctor? What was their background? This is their prediction. And then the green dot is once you add in the coefficient, the impact of their military experience that they have. So you can see some of these presidents went from Truman, oh, not so much. Truman, he definitely led our country in war, right? So he's over here. The reason there's no line with these individuals is because they were not, that's the baseline factor. There was no like addition, it was part of the intercept. So we can see that these factors do have some type of influence on aggregate over whether or not their country would be at war, or not, I don't want to say at war, but would be in a militarized conflict while they were in charge. What else is interesting? We might be interested in some of the outliers. The Logistic DX package is a great package for bringing up a number of outliers, such as delta beta hat. And just to give an idea on what this might be, beta hat is the coefficient for that individual, or for the factor of interest. The idea is if they were removed from the data set, what would the change be to beta hat? That's the idea behind most of these metrics. And terrible to look at. I know it looks like a constellation. We could all imagine that this is what the night sky looks like. I bring to your attention some of the people that we looked at before, the initial ones. They don't seem to be outliers. There were a few who I believe every indicator said that they wouldn't go to war, but their country was, or every indicator said they would be at war and their country wasn't. So that's why we have some outliers like that. Other things to note, what I don't want to do is end up, like I said, on New York Times. It's why Jared usually asks me, or those who are in the military when they present, to be in uniform. I said, Jared, I can't be here, a guy in the Army talking about how we might all be potential warmongers. That is not at all what I'm saying, at all. So, and I didn't want it to look as if an Army guy was saying it. What I am saying, though, is as we look through the data, there were certainly some things you could debate about, like what is a militarized dispute, like what is a conflict. So I didn't assemble the data. I'm not throwing my hands up, but what I am saying is some things are up for debate on how we would categorize some of these factors. Other things is there's certainly, we can't draw causality of this. We can't say that because a president or a world leader has a military experience that they are more likely to have their country at war. Because oftentimes one might think if we are at war, we might want to elect a president with some type of military experience so that they have some sort of intuition about the proper way to employ it, or that we wouldn't want to do it, or they might be more hesitant about the way it's used. So let's not call causality out of this. And I only showed US presidents on here. Notice, I should point out that of the presidents that are in the data set, every single one of them except for Garfield was categorized as having been a wartime president. So that probably says a little bit more about our country than it does about the presidents in charge of it, that we just happen to be at conflict a lot. I appreciate the time. I was afraid this might last. I might run out of slides, but it looks like I didn't. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about it. Jared, thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Thank you all.